Hello, I am so happy to be here with Justin Ayars. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled you're here. I had the great pleasure of being introduced to Justin recently, and just a little bit of what I've learned about him. He's a former trial lawyer, spent some time at a British naval boarding school. He's a fan of Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry's vision of a diverse future where people of all backgrounds work together. He was recently named a top 34 LGBTQ plus founder. I find him to be deeply curious. He talked a lot about taking the road less traveled. And then there's this beautiful alchemy of all of the interesting twists and turns that have led to something that inspires the heck out of me, which is his current entrepreneurial venture, founding EqualityMD, where he's empowering members of underserved communities to become the superheroes of their own healthcare stories. If that's not inspiring, I do not know what is. Justin, it's so good to have you here. Thank you again.
Absolute pleasure.
So tell us a little bit, 10,000 foot view of what you want to share about your professional journey.
I often say I'm a recovering healthcare trial lawyer. I used to defend insurance companies, so I got a in the trenches view as to how inequitable our healthcare system was when I was working for the dark side. That turned into a 15-year entrepreneurial career during the Great Recession when all young attorneys lost their jobs, myself included. But that was a blessing in disguise. I always say the universe gives you exactly what you need when you need it, not when you want it. And for the past 15 years, I've been doing my best to live intentionally and create mission-driven companies that align with my personal values. And I found that a lot of other organizations and individuals also want to be mission driven and have a company that's profit and purpose. And that is why I created EqualityMD.
It's beautiful. And I mentioned being superheroes of their own healthcare stories. Tell us a little bit more about what really fuels the work that you're doing there.
In order to be able to move forward, we have to look back. And historically speaking, the LGBTQ plus community, of which I'm a member, has historically received lack of access to care, faces these different types of healthcare issues that other communities don't. And that's why it's an NIH health disparity population as of 2016. But what they left off was the historical systemic discrimination from within the medical community itself. And in doing intensive customer research discovery, we found that 1 in 3 of our community experience discrimination in a clinical setting, which causes 1 in 4 to avoid care altogether. 1 in 6 are denied care, as I was at one point in my life. And 1 in 8 live in states where providers can legally deny care, which is just beyond the pale. Makes people not want to go to the doctor, surprisingly. Without patients going to doctors and without the ability to know more about this patient population from a clinical standpoint, collecting important patient profile information like sexual orientation, gender identity, it's impossible for healthcare system corporations, be they hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, to create the safe space, be it digital or in person, to have the community that's been marginalized for generations reimagine how they can interact with healthcare. What we're doing is just that, training providers to be culturally competent using evidence-based scientific standards so that the providers in the mental health, the primary care and urgent care space can create the safe spaces digitally where our community can be their authentic selves, receive the care they deserve with agency, dignity, and respect. And in so doing, they'll feel like the superheroes of their own healthcare stories. They'll be able to manage their medications, their medical records, and choose who they see based on their intersectional identities and their unique healthcare conditions.
It's amazing. And those statistics, given that we're in 2024, that was one of the things that just blew my mind when we first spoke. And we talk so much about creating safe spaces in the workplace, but where could it possibly be more important than when it comes to healthcare? And again, for me to understand in my conversation with you previously, the degree to which that is not the case is shocking. And it just makes the work you're doing so incredibly inspiring and important. What would you like folks to know about you personally? Things maybe people don't know, anything you'd like to share?
I'm secretly an introvert. A lot of that stems from, as a child, I was pretty overweight. At age 12, I weighed 200 pounds. Currently, at age 42 and height 6'1", I weigh 175. And it prevented me from things like not being picked for the kickball team in school and avoiding social situations, even like going to the neighborhood park and playing with the local kids. But I think that helped create a sense of self that I was able to force myself to overcome, particularly by the time at William Mary as an undergrad, starting in 99, ending in '03. I was able to embrace that, what I saw then as a weakness, and transform that into a strength and force myself into uncomfortable situations to the point where I became comfortable in those uncomfortable situations. Because life is all about navigating different types of scenarios, and not all of them are going to be lollipops and rainbows. The question is, how do you deal with that? Do you act or do you react? And a huge philosophy that I believe in is Henry David Thoreau's living deliberately. If you act intentionally, listen actively, communicate effectively, and live deliberately, you can overcome things that you might not have been able to overcome, whether it's body image, whether it's being uncomfortable in social situations in general, as an introvert typically is. Although I say never give a lawyer a microphone, that is an old joke, but to get that microphone in my hand still takes some building up of courage, even for me in this day and age. And I acknowledge that and I embrace it rather than shy away from it.
Yeah, beautiful. So in terms of your pronouns, what are the pronouns that you choose?
I use pronouns he, him.
Okay. And in terms of your intersectionality, how would you describe yourself?
I'd say whiter than paper, Scotch, Irish, English, cisgendered, gay man. And while those parts of my identity are critical to the work I do and who I am, they don't define me. I think that there are aspects of everybody's personality. We all have different intersectionalities of identities, be they race, socioeconomic status, geography, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, even differences of thought, different beliefs, and embracing those and finding the commonalities and how they can strengthen one's resolve to embrace your own differences internally and not pick one and say, this is who I am, because it's easy to do. But say, how does my love of Star Trek or art or music enhance my sexual orientation and gender identity? How does that enhance the fact that I'm whiter than paper? And how can I utilize those things and transform them into different opportunities, different lenses by which to view the work we're doing with EqualityMD and healthcare? When you think about it, it's really remarkable how many aspects of humanity intersect. And if we can see them and embrace them and utilize them in everyday life, be they as an entrepreneur, as a partner, as a friend, as just someone navigating the world, I think we can all really live to our fullest potential.
My absolute favorite quote of all times is Oscar Wilde, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. And that's what I kept thinking about as you were speaking. So turn the corner a little bit into the story that you want to share. The podcast is a place where underrepresented people talk about the extra layers we navigate as we wind our way into the already complicated career landscape. And your story, I alluded to at the beginning, is just this really fascinating series of interesting events that twisted and turned and have brought you through to where you are now with EqualityMD. So whatever portions of that story you'd like to share to have people understand how that defined your career path. I know I'm not supposed to turn the microphone over to a lawyer, but I'm going to do it.
I'd have to start back at my birth in Las Vegas and Liberace announcing my birth on stage because he was my godfather. My dad was his conductor and his musical arranger. So I was born into a very prominent showbiz family. And we had the Rockettes over for dinner. My dad did several albums with Barbra Streisand, who was a regular dinner guest. I have some memories of that as a young kid, but I had no appreciation as to whose feet I was tripping over, whether it was Bill Cosby or Jerry Lewis, who were our neighbors, or the Rockettes stealing Liberace's rings and him telling me, don't go too far with those. They're worth more than you are. But then when Liberace died in '87, my mom and my dad moved us back to Northern Virginia in McLean, where the CIA is located, because my mom's family helped create the CIA back in '47 with the National Securities Act. I have this interesting growing up perspective of music razzle dazzle, but also American James Bond. that really helped shape my worldview. The year gap year I had between undergrad and law school, in which I served as a history teacher at a rural naval boarding school in rural England. And I lived in a boarding house with 71 boys. I'm surprised I'm not guilty of 71 counts of murder. But that experience in teaching kids and inspiring them really empowered who I am in a sense, because it helped me further get over the introvert tendencies of not wanting to engage, because I was forced to engage. And a lot of times people picture themselves in the front of a classroom and teaching kids, and it's daunting, sometimes scary even to think about. So it was challenging, but it prepared me for law school, and then it prepared me for my clerkship, and then prepared me for being a trial litigator. And that in turn, all of those things, along with traveling, prepared me for being an entrepreneur. Then I suppose you could say you got to jump in the pool at some point. And so I did so with a coffee shop called Jitters. Well, it quickly became an LGBTQ safe space for youth. And we didn't anticipate that. We didn't plan it. It's just some local high school kids figured out that we were gay and they felt comfortable coming there. Then when we sold that, we opened up a restaurant nightclub in Richmond, Virginia, became a safe space for LGBTQ individuals in the city, even though we didn't advertise it as an LGBTQ bar. People just figured out through stories about the restaurant that it was owned by two gay men. Therefore, it was automatically a gay bar when it wasn't. That's when Bill Harrison, who ran the Diversity Richmond at the time called the Gay Community Center of Richmond, said, why don't you start something like an LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce? And I thought, why not? Let's do it. Well, I said, you got to show up to everything, be your authentic self and give first. That's the only way to go through this life.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. And I grew the organization from one member, my restaurant, to over 100 with 5 corporate sponsors, including Capital One and Altria.
Wow.
And brought it into the family of the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce called the NGLCC in less than a year. As I travel across the country talking to community leaders, Fortune 500 executives, I kept getting one question, because lawyers are counselors at life, not just counselors at law, despite what that piece of paper says. As a counselor at life, the one question I received more than any other, even back when I was in undergrad, was where can I find a doctor who makes me feel safe? That question has resonated deeply with me. And over the years, I've had to hide who I am, that part of my identity, the sexual orientation part, from medical providers. And in 2017, I went in for a dermatologist appointment in DC. The doctor, when he realized that I was gay, refused to complete the physical examination because he didn't feel comfortable touching my skin. He left the room. I was wearing one of those awkward hospital gowns, so it was awkward to begin with. But that was just, I didn't know, you didn't even know what to do. The lawyer in me should have said, I'll sue your ass. But my lawyer hat was in some other room. And I was just a human being in a hospital gown who had heard something you'd never thought he'd hear. And so when I got dressed and went to the receptionist, she said, oh, why don't you go talk to your own people and find someone within your community that can help you? And similar experience trying to raise money. I got in the door because I look the way I do. And my brother always says it's going to take my gay card because I don't watch RuPaul's Drag Race. I don't give a crap about any of that. I'm terrible when it comes to fashion. I can't cook. When I tried cooking, the fire department showed up. It was trying to raise money for a company. And when pitching to them, the letters LGBTQ came out of my mouth, as they naturally would, because I've been striving to build mission-driven companies that are LGBTQ inclusive for the past 15 years. All the investors started getting uncomfortable and picking up their phones and looking at them. And then one of them afterwards, who I'd known for about 3-4 years, put his hand on my shoulder and said, why don't you speak to some of the LGBTQ high net worth folks out there and get people from your community? And knowing him for years, and he'd known what we were doing and thought it was a viable financial opportunity. And I said, but you are my community, because he's part of our local Richmond, Virginia entrepreneurial ecosystem. He thought I was calling him gay. He turned bright red and said, no, your community. And so I said, would you say this to a woman or a Black person or a veteran or someone with a disability? He turned bright red, even redder than he could. I walked away. And even though I look the way I do, I can get into rooms that maybe others can't. I'm keenly aware of those aspects and those privileges that I have. But at the same time, there are challenges that people who are white, cis, male continue to face Others certainly face challenges that I don't, and I respect that entirely. And that's one of the things we're trying to alleviate with EqualityMD. But it starts by having those personal experiences firsthand, in addition to hearing for almost 20 years that question, where can I find a doctor who makes me feel safe? The one thing that had remained consistent was not only my intentional acts of creating safe spaces, a profits plus purpose for our underserved LGBTQ community, but also building, nurturing, cultivating authentic relationships built on mutual respect and trust. And over time, that collective social capital, your network is really your net worth, be able to transform those relationships. Again, that go back decades, not just me, but other members of my team, that allow us to turn those into our channel distribution partners so we can organically give the product that we're about to launch, EqualityMD, put that into the hands of consumers and have that level of trust. And that level of trust can't be bought. It can't be used through Google Ads. It's very much at the grassroots level. There's that level of authenticity that you just can't buy. And that's why bigger companies haven't done this. And those that have tried to do that with our community have failed because it fell on deaf ears. With healthcare, the question is, how are you helping me live my best life? And the answer is you're not. You're just checking a box. And we are doing anything but.
Yeah, anything but. And I can't help but come back to that story because I was so shocked that had happened to you. And we're not talking about in 1922. We're talking about fairly recently.
Yeah.
Talk about a space that is inherently supposed to be safe and that there's an oath to make you be safe. And then that happens. Can you describe a little bit more about how that felt?
I felt ashamed, and I didn't think that was a reaction I would have. First of all, I didn't think that experience would ever happen. But when it did, I felt dirty and ashamed for being who I was.
Cool.
And it took some intestinal fortitude to get up, change, and walk out of there. I thought this really is why years people have been saying, where can I find a doctor who makes me feel safe? If I experienced that, I can only imagine the level of people who don't look like I do, the discrimination they've experienced, who are part of our community. What's fascinating about the LGBTQ community is that it represents every demographic on Earth, as well as every other marginalized communities. And that includes racial minorities to military veterans. So a lot of ways that companies, be they in the healthcare space or not, can really embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or if that's a dirty word for them and they just want to be more inclusive in their hiring practices, in their internal policies and procedures, in their outreach and engagement efforts to a largely invisible patient population, LGBTQ is the best place to start. Because if you can get that, it's almost like the tip of a spear that opens up opportunities to discover more about the intersectionality of race and maybe even religion and geographic diversity, socioeconomic, and see how that interplay on the individual level allows patients to express who they are in a clinical setting, and clinicians and other practitioners in the healthcare space learn how the different patient profiles that are presented and the different preferences that patients have really influence how healthcare is delivered. So in addition to taking that experience in DC and building EqualityMD, we've learned from our healthcare partners and friends that if they have this type of data, they can make meaningful changes at the institutional level so that while we're advancing health equity through our platform with culturally competent care, we're collecting new data in a HIPAA compliant way that enables practitioners at the institutional level and even pharmacists to be able to understand who we are as people, how we interact with care, how we interact with clinicians, or more importantly, how we don't, and how they can change their internal policies, develop new ways of engaging our community, new ways of talking, using the right language to our community when we're patients, such that we don't avoid care out of fear of experiencing potential discrimination. That's how you advance health equity at scale, is through respectful data analytics that can change how not only LGBTQ patients perceive and receive care, but how practitioners and healthcare institutions perceive our invisible patient population.
One of the things I've thought about is why aren't the stories shared? And I have this theory for myself that who wants to dwell on those moments, the difficult moments, the uncomfortable moments, right? We all just want to lead quote unquote normal lives and keep moving and plowing ahead. And at least in my experience, I believe that was a part of why people who were really close to me hadn't heard some of my stories. It wasn't the thing that I chose to talk about. Going back one more time to that experience with that doctor that you had in DC, is it a story that's been something that you had shared much? How did that play out?
I hadn't shared that story until the fall of 2023. That took place sometime late spring, early summer of 17. And I still haven't seen a dermatologist since. I will, because I have to throw myself out there, and EqualityMD is certainly going to help with that.
Yeah.
It's like, what's that Rogaine commercial? I'm not just a salesman, I'm a customer.
Yeah.
That same kind of thing. We're absolutely, our team, because we live the problem we're solving, we're excited to use our own product.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But at the time, I didn't feel the need to share it. It's like when I was at the law firm, I didn't feel the need to share who I authentically was, that portion of my identity, because I was afraid to. And I thought that if I shared that story, it might come off as a weakness. And particularly from an investor standpoint, and people don't want to hear weaknesses. They want to see nothing but strength. And I think that's a terrible way for us to go through life, especially in the startup world, which is hard enough as it is. But I started sharing it again in 2023 as we were just culminating our time at the Cedars-Sinai Accelerator in Los Angeles. I was about to do a pitch on stage at the Las Vegas Convention Center in front of thousands of people, 2 blocks from where I was born at Sunrise Hospital, 1 block from where we lived, and 1 block from where Liberace announced my birth at the Vegas Hilton, now called the Westgate, which is ironically where my dad used to work with Elvis during the 70s when it was called the International Hotel. So there a lot of culmination. And I thought, you know what, screw it. I'm going to tell this story to the world. And I did. I had butterflies. My gut was conserving all the butterflies and not being able to let them out. And all of a sudden I let them out. And it was a wonderful, fun pitch to deliver.
Wow.
The audience said, you're the only one that smiled and seemed like they had fun on stage. But I didn't tell that story for years because I didn't feel there was a place to tell it, a time to tell it, or a way to tell it in a way that could transform that experience into a change that I could then implement in a meaningful way that could then scale. It took the pandemic. It took EqualityMD. It took failing and trying and failing and trying and going through accelerators to finally say, going back to my hometown of Vegas, this is how I'm going to do it.
Wow. And when you say fun, I feel like I know why it was fun. Tell us why it was fun to tell that story.
Part of it, just speaking at the Vegas Convention Center for me was fun because there's so much of my family history in that city. And it's not normal family history. So I thought that was fun. And I was being the showman, just like Liberace was. And one of the biggest things I ever remember telling me is always know your audience. And I thought, this is how I know my audience. Is I know myself. I know the audience we're serving. I know the audience I'm presenting to. Is everyone going to love what we're doing? No, of course not. But I think more people at this healthcare convention are going to get why we're doing what we're doing and relate to the story. Maybe not personally, but it is a personal story that they can, in some respects, either see themselves in or see how someone could be in that situation and how those types of interactions, particularly in a very clinical setting, a very intimate setting, one of the most intimate relationships you can have as patient provider.
Sure.
How those can impact one's life and health in future.
Yeah. Did you feel some relief finally getting it out there?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. And the reaction was almost, you could hear a gasp because I gave that pause. One of the 3 things as a trial lawyer you learn to do is always admit when you don't know the answer when the judge asks you a question. defer to your opposing counsel when they make a great argument, say, yes, you're absolutely right. Try to counter that with something else, but also silence. So I gave it the proper number of beats of silence to really sink in, because dermatologists are by definition supposed to touch your skin. So it was a tactile relationship experience that others could feel, in a sense, even if they weren't there and even if it happened years ago. So it was liberating in a sense. And I continue to share that story as a sign of strength that I, in my own way, have overcome the fear of sharing it with others.
Yeah. And if you were to just look back on this crazy, fascinating journey in a sentence or two, what would you want the listeners to take away from your story?
Always live authentically. That's a very big ask. I think it really comes down to embracing who you are, but do so knowing your surroundings. Again, knowing your audience. There's certain times where coming out is the absolute right thing to do at the right place at the right time. Other times it doesn't matter. You just get the job done and your sexual orientation, gender identity has nothing to do with it. But always know that you are who you are and be proud of who you are. And that's another way of living intentionally and strategically. I think anybody can do anything they want. It's just a question of living authentically, but first knowing who you are. And that knowing who you are is a lifetime journey. We'll never know exactly who we are.
Right.
That's half the fun.
Yeah.
You have to put yourselves in those uncomfortable situations and see how you deal with it. Always work to improve yourself, because I think living authentically is change. Life is change. And if you change with it authentically, you can do almost anything.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to turn now and go to the segment of the podcast called It's My Podcast. So there will be music. And music, like stories, I think is a universal language and really gets to the heart of who we are. And would love to know if there were a song that you could put in a time capsule and preserve for future generations. What would it be and why?
I think beyond what you just said, music is the culmination of humanity. It's Jefferson long ago said that his generation, the founding fathers, created America, and not perfect by any means, but they created something so that the next generation could be tradesmen, lawyers, business people, so that the next generation after that could be philosophers, artists, poets. Of course, that never happened, but the idea, I think, rings true because he spoke to the type of art that defines a civilization. I've always believed that music is a foundational part of that. And of course, I'm somewhat biased being raised in a hyper intense musical family. Also, my mom was the protege of Rachmaninoff, which is crazy.
Of course.
Of course. So, and as a kid, my way of rebelling was not learning how to read music. I regret that to this day.
Never too late.
It's true. It's true. Got a lot going on right now, but yeah.
Yes.
So in the meantime, instead of learning how to read music and write and compose music, because I compose symphonies in my head, which is wonderful, but annoying because I can't reduce it to writing. I love music. I was raised on classical, as I mentioned, going to the Kennedy Center, but also classic rock. My first show was Eric Clapton outside of Liberace, and that was amazing. But all of that can be traced back to classical music. And I thought of what song just lifts me up and elevates my spirits, not so religiously speaking, but in some sort of ethereal way, touches the soul of what the human condition is. And that is a song that's usually a postlude at Easter services in various churches across the world called Widor's Toccata. It's a lengthy song. It's considered the hardest piece of music to play on an organ, often accompanied with timpani and trumpets. And it's a powerful piece that just, no matter what religion, denomination, or atheist, if you just sit back and listen, and the sound on your stereo is so loud it vibrates, or even better yet, listen to it live, it lifts your soul to a higher plane and gives you hope. And I think musical scores can do the same by intersecting art of film with the art of music. And that's very hard to do. Of course, I love composers like Hans Zimmer, who's sort of it in Hollywood now. I love his rendition on James Bond. I'm a huge Bond fan. But Star Trek too, not only am I a Star Trek fan, and yes, I'm biased, but the score done by a lesser known composer named James Horner if you just listen to it, it also is absolutely uplifting because it's complex, similar to what Mozart was, but it has the simplicity and complexity of Beethoven. Hans Zimmer's more Beethoven. But those two pieces, the toccata, the White Horse Toccata, and the score of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, came out in 82, written by James Horner, used again in Star Trek III, I think are powerful things that really uplift the soul and speak to the height of what the human condition can attain if only we continue to stay curious and look up and wonder what if.
I love that. And I love that you traced it all the way back to classical music to get at the heart, it sounds like, of what inspires all music and that magic that you can't explain that happens when you listen. I listened to both songs. They're beautiful. And the words I wrote down afterward were triumph and victory. That's what they evoked for me. I don't usually let people have two, but I'm going to give you two. We'll add them to the Spotify playlist for sure. Okay. As we're winding toward the end, please let us know where people can find out more about what you're doing.
Certainly EqualityMD.com is the best sole source of information, but also my LinkedIn page. As we're getting ready to launch our full product, we're very excited to unleash our channel distribution partners and get this into the hands of consumers, both individuals as well as businesses, as this is a wonderful employee benefit, either as a full-time way to integrate into your employee benefit system or human resources options, but also as a fringe benefit. I think that following my LinkedIn, that's where I'm going to be doing some posting. We've surprisingly received several awards. As you mentioned, I got top 34 LGBTQ founders by PitchBook, which is not LGBTQ specific, but all startup world. So that was a big deal from the vertical of healthcare and startups. But then also top 25 by Founders First recently, a community driven organization as top 25 LGBTQ founders, and then top 100 founders that are LGBTQ in the world by Gangels, which is one of our investors too. All this press really speaks to the power of the relationships that we have spent decades engendering, because it all comes down to human connectivity. Are we actually connecting? Are we actually helping people live their best lives? And that's really what it's all about.
Fantastic. And it'll be in the show notes, but just for those listening, it's Justin Ayars, Ayars.
Yes. Not the English spelling.
Yeah. And so check him out, including on LinkedIn. And Justin, I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to meet you and start to learn about your story. There's so much today that I learned additionally that now I can't wait till we reconnect and I can find out about all of the people in your early life. I'm so fascinated, but more importantly, so inspired by the work that you're doing and the ways in which you've taken your lived experience and really transformed it in mission-based, inspiring ways to make a difference in the world. And so honored that you've been here with us today on the podcast. So thank you.
Thank you for letting me share my story. It's been fun and it's been a privilege.
Awesome. Thank you again. That brings this episode of Stories We Haven't Shared to a close. I believe stories are our humanity waiting to be shared, and listening makes it possible. Thank you so much for being here today by the virtual campfire. Until next time, and thank you again to Justin. Take care.
Cheers.